January 8th, 1940, 08:45 hours. A queue outside a grocer's shop, South London. Dorothy Mitchell stood in the rain, with her ration book clutched inside her coat, protecting it from water that might smudge the precious coupons inside. She'd been queuing for 40 minutes, watching the line inch forward as each customer presented their book and received whatever meager portions their week's coupons entitled them to. Around her, other women waited with the same patient endurance, the same careful protection of their ration books, the same mental calculation of how to make inadequate supplies stretch across 7 days of feeding families. The queue moved. Dorothy advanced 3 feet. She could see the grocer's window now. Shelves that before the war had been crowded with goods now held scattered items separated by empty space. No tinned fruit, no imported cheese. Sugar was limited to 2 ounces per person per week. Butter to 2 ounces, bacon to 4 ounces. Meat was rationed by value rather than weight, 1 shilling and twopence worth per person weekly, which translated to perhaps a pound of cheaper cuts if you were lucky and strategic. Dorothy had her shopping list memorized, had calculated exactly what her family's coupons would purchase, had planned the week's meals around those rations, supplemented by whatever vegetables she could obtain without coupons and whatever she'd managed to grow in their small back garden. Breakfast would be porridge with a scraping of margarine. Lunch would be vegetable soup bulked with potatoes. Dinner would be stew with minimal meat supplemented by root vegetables and dumplings made from saved flour. Tea would be weak but hot, stretched by reusing leaves multiple times. It wasn't starvation. Britain wasn't facing famine like some nations experienced during war. But it was perpetual scarcity, endless careful management of resources that were never quite adequate, constant mental arithmetic of how to make too little become enough. And this work, the queuing, the planning, the stretching, the improvising, fell almost entirely to women like Dorothy who managed households while men served in military or worked in industries that fed the war machine. When her turn finally came, Dorothy presented her ration book to the grocer, who carefully cut the appropriate coupons and provided her week's allowances. She carried her purchases home in a worn shopping bag, already calculating how she'd distribute them across the week, which meals would receive the precious butter, how she'd divide the single egg among 3 people, whether she should save the bacon for Sunday breakfast or spread it across multiple meals. This was her war work. Not glamorous, not celebrated, but absolutely essential. Britain's survival depended on keeping its population fed, despite German submarines sinking merchant ships, despite agricultural workers being conscripted for military service, despite imports dropping to fractions of pre-war levels. If housewives couldn't make rationing work, if they couldn't transform inadequate supplies into adequate nutrition, Britain would be starved into submission without Germany needing to invade. Dorothy and millions like her were fighting that battle daily, armed with ration books and teapots and determination that Britain would carry on regardless of what privation that required. The reality of starvation. Britain's food situation in 1939 was strategically vulnerable in ways that immediate crisis of war made apparent. Before the war, Britain imported approximately 60% of its food: grain from North America, meat from Argentina and Australia, sugar from the Caribbean, tea from India and Ceylon, fruit from Mediterranean regions. The nation had developed this import dependence over decades of industrialization that had shifted population from agriculture to manufacturing, creating wealth that could purchase food globally, but reducing domestic agricultural capacity that could feed population independently. When war came and German U-boats began attacking merchant shipping, This import dependence became existential threat. In 1940, as the Battle of the Atlantic intensified, shipping losses mounted. Merchant vessels carrying food supplies were torpedoed crossing the Atlantic. Convoy system reduced losses but also reduced efficiency, as ships traveled in protected groups at slower speeds rather than independently at maximum velocity. Port facilities were bombed, destroying stored food and disrupting distribution. The tonnage of food reaching Britain dropped substantially below pre-war levels. The government's response was comprehensive rationing system designed to ensure equitable distribution of scarce resources and prevent hoarding that would starve some while others stockpiled. The Ministry of Food, established in 1939, became one of war's largest bureaucracies, managing everything from import priorities to distribution systems to nutritional standards to public education about making rationing work. Rationing began incrementally. Bacon, butter, and sugar were rationed starting January 1940. Meat followed in March. Tea in July. A psychologically significant moment as tea rationing struck at fundamental element of British identity. By 1942, most foods were rationed either through coupon systems that allocated specific quantities or point systems that allowed consumer choice within constraints. Only vegetables, bread, and fish remained unrationed, creating dietary patterns heavily dependent on those staples. The quantities allocated were carefully calculated to provide adequate nutrition while reflecting available supplies. An adult's weekly rations in 1942 typically included 4 ounces of bacon or ham, 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of cheese, 2 ounces of tea, 8 ounces of sugar, 1 shilling and tuppence worth of meat, 1 egg, and varying amounts of milk, depending on family composition. These quantities were adjusted periodically based on supply availability and nutritional requirements, but they remained consistently meager by pre-war standards. The Housewife's mathematics. Managing household nutrition on rationed supplies required skills that combined accounting, chemistry, psychology, and improvisation. Dorothy Mitchell's approach was typical of millions of British housewives who'd become amateur nutritionists and efficiency experts by necessity. She maintained careful records of her family's ration books, tracking which coupons had been used and which remained available. She planned menus a week in advance, calculating exactly how rations would be distributed across meals. She studied Ministry of Food leaflets that explained nutritional requirements and suggested recipes for making limited ingredients stretch. Her weekly planning session happened each Saturday evening after the family had gone to bed. She'd spread her ration books on the kitchen table alongside her recipe collection and scrap paper for calculations. She'd inventory what remained in her cupboards from previous week. She'd check her vegetable garden to see what was ready for harvest. Then she'd plan 7 days of meals that would use her family's rations completely while providing adequate nutrition, variety when possible, and at least appearance of proper meals rather than obvious subsistence. The calculations were complex. Rationed items had to be distributed carefully. Using all the butter on Sunday's scones meant going without for rest of week. The single egg might be scrambled and shared for breakfast, or saved for baking when accumulated with neighbors' eggs, or used to make custard that could stretch across multiple servings. Meat was precious and required strategic deployment. A small joint for Sunday dinner that would provide bones for soup later, or mince extended with breadcrumbs and vegetables to make multiple meals. Unrationed items became increasingly important. Potatoes were dietary staple, served with nearly every meal, prepared in every possible variation to provide illusion of variety. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, cabbage Whatever grew in Victory Gardens supplemented rations with bulk, if not excitement. Bread, while unrationed, was often in short supply and required queuing, but it provided calories that helped stretch everything else. The Ministry of Food promoted various techniques and recipes designed to help housewives manage. Woolton pie, named after Minister of Food, was vegetable pie with pastry crust that used no rationed ingredients. Lord Woolton's carrots could be prepared in dozens of ways, attempting to make monotonous vegetables seem varied. Mock foods appeared: mock cream from margarine and milk, mock fish from vegetables shaped and flavored to vaguely resemble actual fish, mock everything when actual anything was unavailable. Some techniques were genuinely helpful. Using vegetable cooking water for soup stock captured nutrients that would otherwise be lost. Grating cheese made limited quantities seem more substantial. Frying foods in minimal fat achieved browning that enhanced flavor without requiring much of precious rationed butter. Other techniques were desperate attempts to maintain normality. Carrot fudge didn't really taste like sugar-based sweets, but it was sweetish and provided activity for children who'd forgotten what actual candy tasted like. The queue culture. Shopping under rationing meant hours spent queuing for basic necessities, a time burden that fell almost entirely on women. Ration coupons entitled holders to specified quantities, but that didn't guarantee availability. If grocer had sold their week's allocation, having coupons meant nothing until next delivery arrived. This created complex system where housewives monitored multiple shops, knew which days deliveries typically arrived, queued early when rumors suggested desirable items were available. Dorothy typically spent 10 to 15 hours weekly just queuing and shopping, far more than the hour or two that pre-war shopping had required. She'd join bacon queue at her registered butcher on Tuesday mornings when deliveries usually arrived. She'd queue for bread at the baker's most afternoons because supplies were unpredictable and you queued when you could, rather than when convenient. She'd check grocer daily to see if eggs had arrived, if cheese was available, if anything unexpected had come in that might improve the week's meals. The queues became social institutions. Women talked while waiting, sharing information about where goods were available, exchanging recipes and techniques, discussing news and rumors. Friendships formed in queues, informal support networks that helped manage rationing's challenges. If you spotted something in short supply, you'd send word to friends who might need it. If someone was ill and couldn't queue, neighbors would shop for them, using their ration books. But queues were also exhausting and frustrating. Standing in cold rain for an hour only to reach the counter and learn that supplies were exhausted meant wasted time and continued scarcity. Shops sometimes received deliveries that sold out within an hour, benefiting those who happened to be present while leaving others without. The system was equitable in theory, but often arbitrary in practice, depending on luck and information and ability to spend hours queuing. Some women became expert at queue strategy. They knew which shops typically had supplies on which days. They developed networks of mutual monitoring. Friends at different shops would telephone each other when desirable items arrived, allowing strategic queuing. They learned to recognize delivery trucks and would follow them to shops, queuing before goods were even unpacked. This wasn't hoarding or black market activity. It was simply efficient use of rationing system within its rules, maximizing chances of obtaining allocated rations. The Victory Garden movement. Domestic food production became essential supplement to rationed supplies, transforming ornamental gardens into productive plots. The Dig for Victory campaign, launched in 1939, encouraged civilians to grow vegetables in any available space. The campaign was remarkably successful. By 1943, approximately 1.5 million people maintained victory gardens, producing over 1 million tons of vegetables annually. Public parks were converted to allotments. Railway embankments grew cabbages. London's parks, including portions of Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens, were ploughed for vegetables. Dorothy's back garden, which before the war had grown flowers and lawn, was converted entirely to vegetables in spring 1940. She planted potatoes, carrots, onions, cabbages, beans, whatever seeds she could obtain, and whatever her limited gardening knowledge suggested might grow. The learning curve was steep. Her first year's harvest was modest, plagued by pests she didn't know how to control and diseases she didn't recognize until crops were destroyed. But she learned. She attended Ministry of Agriculture classes on vegetable growing. She read pamphlets about pest control and crop rotation. She consulted neighbors who had more experience. By her third year, her garden was productive enough to significantly supplement her family's diet. Fresh vegetables through growing season, stored roots through winter, preserved foods she'd canned or pickled, extending harvest benefits across months. The garden required substantial labor: digging, planting, weeding, watering, harvesting, preserving. This work came on top of everything else Dorothy managed: queuing for rations, cooking meals, maintaining household, managing families' needs. But it was productive labor that yielded tangible results, putting food on table that would otherwise be unavailable. The satisfaction of serving vegetables she'd grown herself, of knowing her work had directly fed her family, made the effort worthwhile. The ritual of tea. Tea maintained symbolic importance that transcended its nutritional value, representing continuity and civilization despite war's disruptions. When tea was rationed to 2 ounces per person weekly in July 1940, it was treated as minor national crisis. Tea was more than beverage. It was ritual that structured daily life, that provided comfort during difficulties, that symbolized British identity in ways that transcended rational explanation. The idea of Britain without adequate tea was almost as disturbing as the idea of Britain without adequate food. Housewives adapted through various techniques. They reused tea leaves multiple times, the tea growing progressively weaker but still providing the ritual of tea drinking even when flavor was minimal. They stretched supplies by adding more water and accepting weaker brew. They saved their best tea for occasions when comfort was most needed. After air raids, when bad news arrived, when life's difficulties required the consolation that strong tea somehow provided. Dorothy maintained tea ritual despite rationing. She made pot of tea every morning, sharing it with her husband before he left for work at munitions factory. She made tea when children came home from school. She made tea when neighbors visited. She made tea after air raids, standing in bombed street with neighbors, all of them drinking weak tea from chipped cups while surveying damage. The tea was weak and supplies were limited, but the ritual persisted, because ritual mattered, because maintaining normalcy in abnormal times required preserving familiar patterns. The government recognized tea's psychological importance. When supplies were particularly tight, tea rations were maintained even when it meant reducing other allocations. Churchill himself insisted that tea must remain available, recognizing its importance for civilian morale. The decision was strategically sound. The comfort and normalcy that tea provided were worth the shipping space it required. Tea also served practical functions. It was hot drink that could be prepared quickly and served to many people from single pot, making it ideal for emergency situations. Canteens organized after air raids served tea to bombed-out civilians and emergency workers, providing warmth and calories and psychological comfort simultaneously. The phrase tea and sympathy captured the beverage's role as vehicle for emotional support, the act of making and sharing tea being expression of care that required few words. The psychological war. Managing rationing's psychological toll required resilience that was itself form of war work. The endless scarcity was wearing in ways that went beyond physical hunger. Dorothy was never starving. Rationing ensured that everyone received adequate calories and basic nutrition. But she was always managing scarcity, always calculating and stretching, always conscious that supplies were inadequate and comfort was unattainable. The mental burden of constantly making too little become enough, of never being able to simply prepare meals without elaborate planning and substitution, accumulated over months and years into persistent, low-grade stress. The monotony was its own hardship. Eating potatoes and root vegetables and minimal meat day after day, week after week, year after year became deadening. Special occasions lost their specialness when no special foods were available to mark them. Birthdays without cake, Christmas without treats, celebrations without abundance. These absences were small compared to war's other privations, but they represented loss of joy and festivity that made life worth living beyond mere survival. Dorothy coped through various strategies. She maintained standards, setting table properly, using good china when available, insisting families sit together for meals even when meals were meager. She created variety through preparation methods rather than ingredients. Potatoes served mashed one day, roasted the next, made into soup the third, turned into mock something else the fourth. She found satisfaction in successful improvisation, taking pride when mock cream actually resembled cream or when vegetable pie was genuinely appetizing. She also drew strength from shared experience. Every housewife faced same challenges, managed same scarcities, employed same techniques. Conversations with neighbors confirmed that everyone struggled, that her difficulties weren't personal failures but universal conditions. This solidarity was sustaining, knowing you weren't alone, that others understood your challenges, that Britain was collectively enduring and would collectively prevail. The unglamorous truth. British housewives' management of rationing wasn't heroic achievement, but necessary adaptation to circumstances they didn't choose and couldn't escape. The narrative of women winning the war through domestic economy is simultaneously true and misleading. True because their work was essential. Without effective household management of rationing, Britain couldn't have maintained its population through years of severe food shortages. Misleading because it suggests choice and achievement rather than necessity and endurance. Dorothy and women like her didn't choose to spend thousands of hours queuing and planning and improvising. They did it because families needed feeding, and no alternative existed. The work wasn't particularly fulfilling or satisfying except in narrow sense of competence, pride in successful meal or productive garden. Mostly it was tedious, exhausting, repetitive labor that consumed enormous time and energy while producing only adequacy rather than excellence. No one aspired to be expert at making rationing work. It was simply what circumstances required, skill developed through necessity rather than interest. The celebration of wartime housewives sometimes obscures this reality, turning grinding necessity into voluntary heroism, reframing exhausting labor as patriotic service. The intent may be honoring women's contributions, but the effect is romanticizing circumstances that were genuinely difficult and extracting unpaid labor that sustained nation through crisis. A more honest accounting would acknowledge both the essential nature of this work and its cost to women who performed it. Thousands of hours, Years of privation, accumulated weariness that didn't end when rationing finally ceased. Dorothy Mitchell never considered herself hero. She'd done what needed doing, managed her family through difficult years, employed skills she'd never wanted to develop to achieve outcomes she'd never chosen to pursue. When rationing ended, she was mainly relieved, grateful that shopping could become simple again, that cooking could be pleasurable rather than exercise in creative scarcity management, that she could finally stop the endless mental arithmetic of making inadequate supplies adequate. That relief, more than any pride or satisfaction, captured the truth of Britain's Housewives' war. They'd endured because endurance was required. They'd managed because management was necessary. They'd kept families fed because families needed feeding. The work was essential and exhausting and largely invisible. And when it finally ended after 14 years, the primary emotion was relief that it was over, gratitude that normal life could resume, hope that never again would such sustained domestic privation be necessary. That was their victory. Not triumph, but survival. Not glory, but simple completion of work that had needed doing for far too long.